They told you Stonehenge was built by primitive Europeans, just some fur-wearing tribes dragging rocks because vibes, no names, no faces, no receipts, just mystery. The kind that conveniently protects the story they already like. But let me ask you something real quick. How does a primitive society move 40-ton stones over 200 miles without wheels, without iron tools, without written language, and align them with the stars more accurately than some modern buildings? See, that's the part they rush past, because if you slow down there, the whole story starts cracking. Stonehenge isn't just a pile of rocks, it's a machine, astronomical, mathematical, engineered with intention, a calendar, a ceremonial site, a spiritual computer carved into earth. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Every ancient culture on the planet that mastered stone, stars, and sacred geometry learned it from somewhere. Knowledge doesn't just pop up fully, formed in the mud. So the real question isn't how Stonehenge was built, it's who had the knowledge to build it, and why their name never comes up. Because while Europe was still figuring out agriculture, Africa was already building with stone so precise you still can't slide a razor blade between the blocks. Let that sit. Egypt, Nubia, Kush, Ethiopia. Civilizations mapping the sky, measuring the earth, aligning temples to solstices and equinoxes thousands of years before Stonehenge ever rose. And not symbolically, scientifically. So when historians tell you Stonehenge was built by local Neolithic farmers with no outside influence, no advanced knowledge, no global connections, that's not history. That's containment. Because if you admit advanced knowledge existed in Africa first, you have to explain how similar systems appear later in Europe. Same alignments, same solar obsession, same stone geometry, different skin tones. And Europe does not like explaining that. Here's another detail they whisper instead of announce. Some of the stones at Stonehenge, the blue stones, were transported from Wales, over rivers, over land, over terrain that would break modern equipment. No wheels, no beasts of burden strong enough, no written plans found. Yet the stones arrived, placed with surgical accuracy, aligned to cosmic events. That's not guesswork. That's inherited science. And inheritance always leaves fingerprints. Now let's talk about timing. Stonehenge's major construction phases line up with a period when long-distance trade routes already existed between Africa, the Mediterranean, and Northern Europe. Yes, trade. Ideas move faster than people, and people move faster than official history admits. Gold from Africa showed up in Europe, ivory, obsidian, symbol systems. But somehow, knowledge didn't. That's the lie. Because megalithic structures don't appear randomly across continents. They follow paths, coasts, rivers, trade routes, migration lines. And guess who dominated those networks early? Africa. Long before Rome, before Greece, before Britain was even Britain. So when you see Stonehenge, you're not looking at an isolated miracle. You're looking at a node, a northern outpost of a much older knowledge system. But if they told you that outright, you'd have to rethink who taught who. And that's dangerous. Because once you realize Africans weren't just present in world history, but instrumental, the whole hierarchy collapses. That's why the language stays vague. Unknown builders, lost knowledge, mysterious origins. Mystery is safer than truth, especially when the truth points south. Now, I'm not saying Africans camped out in England building Stonehenge stone by stone. That's the straw man they want you to argue. I'm saying the knowledge system behind Stonehenge looks a lot more like Africa than Europe wants to admit. Same sky focus, same solar math, same sacred geometry, same obsession with aligning earth to heaven. Coincidence or inheritance? Because once you trace where that knowledge was already mastered, long before Stonehenge, you end up in one place. And that's when the question shifts from, did Africans build Stonehenge, to something far more threatening? Who taught Europe how to think in stone? And why was their name erased? And once you ask that, there's no going back. They show you Stonehenge like it just appeared. No fingerprints, no builders, just mist, druids, and vibes. That's the trick. When history can't explain something, it dresses it up in mystery instead of asking the uncomfortable question, who actually had the knowledge to do this? Because let's be real, Stonehenge is not random rocks. Those stones weigh up to 40 tons. Some were hauled from over 150 miles away, not rolled downhill, not floated conveniently, dragged, lifted, positioned with precision, and not just stacked, aligned, engineered, calibrated to the sun and the stars. That already narrows the field. This wasn't done by cave dwellers guessing. This was done by people who understood astronomy, geometry, seasonal cycles, and stone technology. People who knew how to move mass before machines. People who understood the sky as a clock. Now ask yourself, who, at that time, was already doing all of that? Because while Britain was still figuring out permanent settlements, Africa had cities. While Europe was learning survival, Africa was measuring time. While the British Isles were in prehistory, the Nile Valley had calendars, architects, and engineers who aligned temples to solstices centuries before Stonehenge was even finished. That's not opinion. That's timeline. Stonehenge's most precise alignment is the summer solstice sunrise and the winter solstice sunset. That alone tells you this wasn't spiritual guessing. Solstice alignment requires long-term observation, generations of sky watching, mathematical tracking of the sun's movement across years. That system didn't originate in Western Europe. It existed in Africa thousands of years earlier. In Kemet, temples like Karnak and Abu Simbel were aligned to solstices with surgical accuracy. Light-piercing inner sanctuaries on specific days only. Same concept. Same obsession with the sun. Same engineering logic. Different continent. Coincidence? Then there's the stones themselves. Blue stones, transported from Wales. Scientists still debate how Neolithic Britons moved them. Some say logs, some say ice, some say rituals. Nobody can prove it. But here's what they don't like to say. Africa already had established stone-moving technology. Obelisks, colossi, monoliths weighing hundreds of tons, moved without steel, without wheels, without modern cranes. Africa solved the stone problem long before Europe even knew it existed. So the question shifts. Not, could Africans do this? But why would they be here? Now we get uncomfortable, because ancient Britain was not isolated. The Atlantic was not a wall. It was a highway. Long before modern nations, there were maritime cultures moving goods, people, and ideas along coastlines. North Africa traded with Iberia. Iberia traded north. Knowledge didn't teleport, it traveled, and we have receipts. Roman writers described dark-skinned peoples in Britain before Rome ever conquered it. Ancient skeletons across Britain show genetic diversity earlier than textbooks admit, and megalithic structures across Europe share design logic with African and Mediterranean systems, not isolated invention. Stone circles didn't pop up once, they spread, from Africa to the Mediterranean to the Atlantic coast. Same geometry, same solar obsession, same ritual math. That's diffusion, not coincidence. But here's where the story gets edited. When archaeology formed as a discipline in the 1800s, it had a mission. Prove Europe built itself. Prove civilization was internal, independent, white. So when evidence suggested external influence, especially African, it got labeled fringe, or symbolic, or myth. They'd rather call Stonehenge a ritual site than admit advanced engineering from a global knowledge stream. Because if you admit Africans had the science, the navigation, and the reach to influence Europe, the whole hierarchy collapses. And notice something else. Stonehenge isn't unique in Britain. There are hundreds of stone circles, but Stonehenge is the most refined, the most complex, the most precise, almost like it wasn't the beginning of knowledge, but the peak of it, like someone brought the blueprint, taught the method, and then left. That pattern shows up everywhere else in history. Advanced systems appear fully formed, then slowly degrade. Egypt, Mesoamerica, Mesopotamia. Knowledge arrives, crystallizes, then fades as access disappears. Stonehenge fits that pattern uncomfortably well. And let's talk symbolism. The circle, the sun, the horizon. death and rebirth cycles. Those are not random spiritual themes, they are African cosmology staples. From the Nile to West Africa, circular time dominates, not linear, cyclical, seasonal, solar. European folklore adopts these ideas later, but Africa lives them early. So why is the African connection never centered? Because Stonehenge isn't just stones. It's proof that ancient Europe was not isolated, that Africa wasn't waiting to be discovered, that black knowledge didn't start in chains, but in calculations. And once you see that, you start noticing how carefully the conversation avoids race, influence, and origin. They'll talk about rocks for hours, but not the minds behind them. So let me ask you something uncomfortable. If Stonehenge required knowledge Africa already had, was it really built in isolation, or was it inherited from people history refuses to name? They tell you. Stonehenge is a mystery. That's the first trick, because when something stays a mystery long enough, people stop asking who benefited from keeping it that way. Stonehenge isn't confusing because the builders were primitive. It's confusing because the wrong people have been credited and the right connections were quietly severed. Let's get straight to it. The mainstream story says Stonehenge was built by Neolithic farmers using antler picks and wooden sleds. No wheels, no advanced math, no written language, just vibes and determination. Sounds inspirational, also sounds incomplete. Here's the part they rush past. Stonehenge isn't just stacked rocks, it's precision engineering. The stones are aligned to solstices with astronomical accuracy that requires long-term sky observation, generational data, and advanced geometry. Not guess and check, not luck. This is calculated knowledge. Now ask yourself, who had that knowledge first, long before Stonehenge? Rose out of Salisbury Plain, Africa was mapping the heavens. The Nabta Playa stone circle in southern Egypt predates Stonehenge by thousands of years. Thousands. Same solar alignments, same astronomical intent, same use of megalithic stones to track celestial cycles. That's not coincidence, that's continuity. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. The people who built Nabta Playa were Africans with dark skin, pastoral astronomers who understood precession, solstices, and stellar cycles before Europe even had permanent settlements. This isn't fringe. Archaeologists admit Nabta Playa exists. They just isolate it, box it off, keep it African, separate from European achievements. But knowledge doesn't respect borders. The Mediterranean wasn't a wall. It was a highway. Trade routes connected North Africa to Iberia, Britain, and the Atlantic coast long before Rome. We know this because African ivory, gold, and symbols have been found across Europe. We know because megalithic building styles suddenly appear in Europe with no local developmental phase. No training wheels, no prototypes. Just boom, monumental stone architecture. That's a red flag. Civilizations don't wake up one morning knowing how to quarry, transport, and erect 50-ton stones with celestial precision. They learn it, or they're taught. And here's another detail they don't like to linger on. The blue stones at Stonehenge were transported over 150 miles from Wales, over rivers, over hills, without metal tools, without wheels. The logistics alone demands centralized planning, leadership, and technical expertise that doesn't match the simple farmer narrative. So where did that expertise come from? Look at the timeline. Megalithic culture spreads across Europe shortly after sustained contact with North Africa increases. The same North Africa that already had stone engineering, astronomy, and ritual architecture perfected. Now let's talk symbolism. Stonehenge isn't just functional, it's ritual, sacred, aligned with death, rebirth, cycles of time. That worldview mirrors African cosmology, especially Nile Valley traditions, where monuments weren't just buildings, they were interfaces between earth and sky. Europe didn't invent that concept, they inherited it. But inheritance becomes theft when the source is erased, and erasure is the pattern. Anytime African knowledge appears outside Africa, it's relabeled as independent invention. Anytime Europeans receive influence, it becomes diffusion from nowhere. No teachers, no travelers, no ancestors worth naming, just magic. But history doesn't work like that. People move. Ideas move faster. There's also the physical evidence nobody wants to sit with. Ancient skeletal remains in Britain from the megalithic period show genetic markers linked to Iberia and North Africa. Not modern migration, ancient migration. Darker skinned populations lived in Britain during the time Stonehenge was active. That alone shatters the image people hold in their heads. Because if Africans or African descended people were present, trading, teaching, intermarrying, then the question isn't, did Africans build Stonehenge? The question becomes, why were they written out of the story? And here's the psychological part. Stonehenge is a crown jewel of European heritage. It symbolizes deep roots, ancient genius, ancestral greatness. If African influence is acknowledged, that symbol cracks. Not because it becomes less impressive, but because it becomes shared. And shared history doesn't serve supremacist myths. So the narrative stays frozen. Africans are kept as spectators to history, never architects. Europe is cast as isolated brilliance, even when the evidence screams interaction. But cracks are forming. New genetic studies, new carbon dating, new comparative archaeology. Every year, the mystery explanation looks weaker. Every year, the connections look clearer. Stonehenge didn't rise from ignorance. It rose from a world already connected, already educated, already exchanging ideas across water and land. And Africa wasn't on the sidelines of that world. So here's the real question they hope you never ask. If African knowledge helped shape one of Europe's most sacred monuments, what else did Africa build that Europe claimed as its own? They tell you Stonehenge is a mystery. Cute word. Mystery sounds harmless, like nobody knows, nobody's responsible, nobody benefits. But let's be honest, history only calls something a mystery when the answer makes the wrong people uncomfortable. Stonehenge didn't just happen. Those stones didn't wake up one morning and decide to stand in a perfect astronomical alignment. Somebody planned it. Somebody measured it. Somebody understood cycles, solstices, geometry, weight, transport, and time. Deep time. And here's the part they rush past. The idacha level of knowledge baked into Stonehenge did not come from trial and error by farmers guessing at the sky. It came from a tradition, a long one. Look at the precision. The stones align with the summer solstice sunrise and the winter solstice sunset. Not roughly, not kinda, precisely. That means the builders tracked the sun over generations. You don't get that accuracy without calendars. You don't get calendars without astronomy. And you don't get astronomy without a culture that values sky knowledge enough to preserve it. Now pause. Ask yourself, who had that level of astronomical science thousands of years before Stonehenge went up? Because it wasn't Iron Age Britain. At the time Stonehenge's earliest phases were being built, large parts of Europe were still developing basic agricultural systems. Meanwhile, along the Nile and across North and Northeast Africa, people were mapping the heavens with terrifying accuracy. Egyptians aligned pyramids to cardinal points with errors smaller than modern buildings. Nubians tracked stellar cycles. Saharan Africans were carving astronomical symbols into stone while the Sahara was still green. That's not opinion. That's archaeological record. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Long before Stonehenge reached its final form, Africa already had stone circles, not folklore, physical sites. Nabta Playa in southern Egypt dates back over 7,000 years. Let that sit. Thousands of years older than Stonehenge. Stone circles, astronomical alignments, solstice markers, calendar systems, built by African pastoralists who understood the sky well enough to organize life around it. So now the question isn't, could Africans build Stonehenge? The question is why Europe is allowed to be isolated from the wider ancient world in these conversations. Because Stonehenge didn't exist in a vacuum. People moved, knowledge moved, trade moved, ideas moved. The Mediterranean wasn't a wall, it was a highway, and Britain wasn't some sealed-off bubble. There's evidence of long-distance trade reaching the British Isles thousands of years ago. Metals, amber, ritual objects. So the idea that knowledge somehow stopped at the English Channel, that's not science, that's storytelling. Here's the trick history plays. They'll say, There's no direct proof Africans built Stonehenge, and they're right. No ancient receipt says built by Africans. But that standard is never applied equally. Nobody asked for a signed contract when crediting Europeans with ancient achievements. Circumstantial evidence suddenly becomes enough when it flatters the dominant narrative. But when Africa enters the frame, the burden of proof becomes impossible. And yet, the fingerprints are there. Look at the engineering logic. Stonehenge wasn't just a monument, it was a ritual calendar, a ceremonial center tied to death, rebirth, and cosmic order. That worldview mirrors African cosmologies where stone, ancestor reverence, and celestial cycles are linked. The idea that stones are living markers of time and spirit didn't originate in Northern Europe. It shows up repeatedly in African spiritual systems. Another uncomfortable layer, population movement. Recent genetic studies show that ancient Britain was not genetically static. There were multiple waves of migration long before the Roman period. Darker-skinned populations existed in Britain in antiquity. That alone doesn't prove African builders, but it shatters the fantasy of a homogeneous, isolated Europe inventing everything alone. And here's the psychological move historians make next. They shrink the African's role without denying contact. Maybe influence, they'll say. Indirect. Coincidental. Funny how coincidence always works one way. Africa builds the earliest known stone calendars. Europe later builds stone calendars. Coincidence. Africa maps the heavens with ritual architecture. Europe later mirrors that logic. Coincidence. Africa develops megalithic traditions thousands of years earlier. Europe later adopts megaliths. Coincidence. At what point does coincidence become inheritance? Because knowledge doesn't teleport. It travels through people. This doesn't mean Stonehenge was built by Egyptians marching into Britain with blueprints. That's a straw man they love to burn. It means the intellectual ancestors of Stonehenge, the math, the astronomy, the spiritual architecture, existed in Africa long before Britain ever stacked its first stone. And once you accept that, the story changes. Stonehenge stops being a symbol of isolated European genius and starts looking like a northern echo of a much older African conversation with the sky. Which brings us to the part they really don't like talking about. If African knowledge influenced one of Europe's most sacred monuments, then Africa wasn't behind. It wasn't waiting. It was leading. And that flips the entire timeline upside down. So the real question isn't, did Africans build Stonehenge? The real question is this: why does the idea of African intellectual ancestry terrify modern history so much that it would rather call brilliance a mystery than trace its roots? They tell you Stonehenge was built by mysterious ancient Britons, like that sentence explains anything. It doesn't. It dodges the real question, because lifting, transporting, shaping, and aligning 40-ton stones isn't folklore, it's engineering. And engineering leaves fingerprints, so let's get straight to it. Stonehenge isn't just a pile of rocks, it's a precision instrument, astronomical alignment, solar cycles, seasonal markers, mathematics embedded in stone. That's not accidental, that's inherited knowledge. And here's where the story gets uncomfortable. That level of knowledge didn't appear in ancient Britain out of thin air. At the time Stonehenge was being raised, Britain had no written language, no surviving record of advanced astronomy, no proven tradition of large-scale stone engineering. Yet Stonehenge lines up with solstices down to degrees modern instruments confirm. Somebody knew exactly what they were doing. Now ask yourself, who in the ancient world had already mastered stone construction, solar alignment, and sacred geometry for thousands of years? Africa. Long before Stonehenge, Africans were building megalithic structures aligned to stars and seasons. Nabta Playa in southern Egypt predates Stonehenge by at least 1,000 years. Stone circles, astronomical calibration, solstice tracking, same principles, same logic, same sky. That's not coincidence, that's continuity. And here's the part textbooks whisper around. Ancient Britain was not isolated, it was connected. Trade routes crisscrossed Europe and the Mediterranean. Tin from Britain was essential for bronze production. And where did bronze culture explode first? North Africa, and the Near East. You don't get that metal without contact, and you don't get contact without movement of people and ideas. Now lean in. Ancient Greek writers openly described Africans traveling, teaching, and settling across the Mediterranean and beyond. Herodotus didn't shy away from it. He said Egypt taught Greece, Greece taught Rome, Rome shaped Europe. That's the pipeline. Break it anywhere, the whole story collapses. So why is Africa cut out of the Stonehenge conversation? Because once you admit knowledge transfer, you have to admit Africans weren't just present. They were authoritative, teachers, architects, specialists. Look at the stones themselves. The blue stones came from over 140 miles away in Wales, 40 tons each. No wheels, no iron tools, no horses. That means logistics, organization, planning across regions. That's state-level coordination, not village folklore. Africa had that, Britain didn't. Not yet. And before someone says, well, Europeans figured it out on their own, pause. Independent invention happens, sure. But identical solutions across cultures usually point to shared knowledge. Same problem, same math, same sky, same answers. Stonehenge doesn't just mark the sun, it ritualizes it. That's key. The structure isn't utilitarian, it's ceremonial, sacred space, cosmic order. That worldview is African at its core. In Egypt, Ethiopia, Nubia, the heavens weren't decoration, they were law, and that belief traveled. There's evidence of African presence in Roman Britain, skeletal remains, DNA, inscriptions, not later, early, soldiers, officials, scholars. If Africans were in Britain under Rome, why is it so unthinkable they were there earlier through trade and migration? Because once you say Africans were present before Rome, the timeline breaks. And when the timeline breaks, the hierarchy collapses. Here's the quiet truth. Stonehenge fits better inside an African knowledge system than a European one. That doesn't mean Africans stacked every stone themselves. It means the blueprint didn't originate on that cold plain. The idea did not start there. Ideas travel faster than people, and Europe has a long history of absorbing African knowledge, then scrubbing the source. Mathematics, medicine, architecture, philosophy. Why would Stonehenge be any different? Notice how documentaries love the word mysterious. Mysterious is a shield. It means we don't want to follow the trail, because following the trail leads south, across the Mediterranean, into Africa. And that's where the story stops being comfortable, because then Stonehenge stops being a European miracle and starts being a borrowed inheritance. So here's the real question they don't want you asking. If Africa was the ancient world's university and Stonehenge speaks fluent astronomical language, who taught Britain how to read the sky? They tell you Stonehenge was built by mysterious ancient Britons, like it just rose out the fog one morning. No names, no faces, just vibes and guesses. That's convenient, because the moment you start asking who actually had the knowledge, the story gets uncomfortable fast. Let's get straight to it. Stonehenge is not just rocks in a circle, that's the tourist version. Stonehenge is astronomy locked into stone, precision, alignment, timing. Those stones are synced to solstices with terrifying accuracy. Summer sun rises dead center, winter sun sets right through the axis. No margin for error, no close enough. Now pause. Ask yourself this. Who in the ancient world was already doing high-level astronomy thousands of years before Stonehenge went up? Because it wasn't Iron Age Britain. Africa had been mapping the sky since before Europe had permanent cities. Nabta Playa in Nubia, modern southern Egypt, northern Sudan, had stone circles aligned to stars and solstices as early as 6000 BCE. That's not fringe. That's published archaeology. Older than Stonehenge by millennia. Same principles. Same celestial obsession, same math embedded in stone. And that's where the silence starts. Because once you admit that Africans were building astronomical stone complexes earlier, the next question hits hard. Did that knowledge stay put or travel? History loves to pretend ancient people were static, like nobody moved, like oceans and continents were walls instead of highways. That's nonsense. Trade routes crisscrossed Africa, the Mediterranean, and Europe long before Rome. Tin, gold, copper, amber. Britain wasn't isolated. Britain was valuable, especially for tin, which the ancient world desperately needed for bronze. Where there's trade, there's knowledge transfer. Always. Now here's where it gets spicy. The blue stones at Stonehenge, the smaller inner stones, were hauled from over 150 miles away from Wales. That alone proves organized labor, planning, and engineering. Sophistication. But the real question is not how they moved them. It's why they were arranged the way they were. Because the layout isn't random. It mirrors sacred geometry found in African and Nile Valley architecture. Circles, axes, cardinal directions, the same cosmic order logic. The idea that the sky governs the earth, that kings, rituals, and monuments must align with the heavens. That worldview didn't originate in prehistoric Britain. It was foundational in Africa. Egypt didn't just build pyramids. They built time, calendars, stellar clocks, deacons. They tracked Sirius so precisely it regulated their entire civilization. Floods, planning, religion, power. And they encoded that knowledge in stone, permanently, publicly, boldly. Stonehenge does the same thing, just quieter. And that's the part nobody wants to talk about. Stonehenge is a whisper of something louder elsewhere, a provincial echo of a global science. Now, before somebody panics and says, "So, you're saying Africans physically built Stonehenge?" Slow down. That's not the only way influence works. Knowledge doesn't need to carry a passport. You don't need African hands on British stones for African science to shape British monuments. Ideas travel faster than people. Priests, navigators, traders, captives, migrants. All it takes is one lineage of knowledge moving north. One group who knows how to read the sky teaching another group who knows how to move stone. And the archaeological record already confirms Africans in ancient Europe. Roman Britain had black Africans, skeletons, DNA, names. That's not debate anymore. If Africans were present in Europe during Roman times, pretending there was zero African presence or influence earlier is pure fantasy, especially when Britain was trading with the Mediterranean world long before Rome conquered it. Now here's the psychological trick they pull. They frame Stonehenge as primitive brilliance, as if ancient. Britons just figured out cosmic math independently in a vacuum. No teachers, no precedents, no global context, just raw genius appearing out of nowhere. But history doesn't work like that. Civilization stacks. Knowledge accumulates. People borrow, refine, adapt. Africa was the deep well. Europe was downstream. And the reason Hollywood and textbooks keep it foggy is simple. If you admit African knowledge shaped one of Europe's most iconic monuments, the whole hierarchy collapses. The story of who taught whom flips. The myth of European originality takes a hit. So instead, they keep it vague. Neolithic people, unknown builders, mysterious purpose. Mystery is a shield because clarity would force a harder conversation. One about African science being global long before Europe was centralized. One about black knowledge shaping the sacred landscapes of the so-called West. And we're not even done yet, because once you dig deeper into the rituals, the burial, practices, the solar symbolism, and the priestly class implied by Stonehenge's use, you start seeing parallels that are impossible to ignore. So the real question isn't, did Africans build Stonehenge? The real question is this: why does Stonehenge look like a student project from a much older African classroom? And who made sure you were never told about the teacher? Stonehenge isn't just rocks stacked by guesswork. That's the lie they teach because the truth asks uncomfortable questions. These stones are aligned, precisely, solstices, equinoxes, lunar standstills, cycles that take decades to notice and generations to confirm. This wasn't a lucky guess. This was long-term astronomical knowledge. Now here's where it gets awkward, because the people most advanced in sky science at the exact time Stonehenge was designed weren't isolated farmers in Britain. They were Africans. In the Nile Valley, in Nabta Playa, in Kush, in ancient Ethiopia, Africans were mapping the heavens with stone circles thousands of years earlier. Not metaphors, not myths. Actual stone calendars aligned to stars. Nabta Playa, southern Egypt, deep in Africa, has stone circles dated to over 6,000 years ago, older than Stonehenge. Same concept, same geometry, same astronomical obsession. Let that sit. Stone circles aligned to solstices don't just appear in human history by coincidence. They spread when knowledge spreads, and knowledge always travels with people. Stonehenge's builders understood precession, that slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 26,000 years to complete. You don't notice that in one lifetime. You track it across generations. That means records, memory systems, teaching structures. Now ask yourself, who on Earth had that kind of institutional knowledge at the time? Africa did. Europe didn't even have writing yet. But Africa had star catalogs. Africa had priest astronomers. Africa had ceremonial complexes aligned with Sirius, Orion, the sun, and the moon. And here's the part they never explain. The blue stones of Stonehenge weren't local. They were dragged over 150 miles from Wales. No wheels, no horses, no iron tools, just logistics that require organization, planning, and command. That's not primitive. That's state-level thinking. And state-level thinking didn't originate in Neolithic Britain. It came from places that already mastered monument building, places like Africa. Now look at the mythology. British folklore says Stonehenge was built by giants, by magical outsiders, by people who weren't regular locals. Funny how ancient Europeans themselves didn't claim ownership. They said, someone else did this, and that someone else was always described as dark, powerful, and foreign. Let's talk trade. The British Isles were not isolated. Amber, tin, copper, all moved through ancient trade routes connecting Europe to the Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean was dominated by African-influenced civilizations, Egypt, Nubia, Phoenicia. Sailors didn't just move goods, they moved ideas, navigation, geometry, sacred architecture. Stonehenge is not unique. It's part of a global tradition of megalithic astronomy. And that tradition's oldest roots are African. Same sun alignments, same circular layouts, same ceremonial emphasis, different location, same blueprint. That's not coincidence, that's diffusion. Now here's the psychological trick they pull. They say, there's no proof Africans were in Britain, but archaeology doesn't preserve skin color. It preserves tools, patterns, systems, and the systems match Africa. Then they say, but Stonehenge was built by locals. Sure, locals can build something once they're taught how. No one is saying Africans stacked every stone. The real question is, who taught the system? Because knowledge always has an origin, and Europe was late to the party. Here's another detail they rush past. Stonehenge's layout reflects sacred geometry ratios used in African temples. Not exactly, but close enough to show lineage, like a copied accent. You can hear where it came from. And then there's the silence. Why do textbooks never compare Stonehenge to African stone circles? Why is Nabta Playa never mentioned in British archaeology classes? Because once you connect those dots, the story breaks. Europe stops being the birthplace of genius and becomes the student. And students don't like admitting who taught them, especially when the teacher was black. So they isolate Stonehenge, turn it into a mystery, call it an anomaly. Because if it's connected to Africa, it's not mysterious at all. It's familiar, and familiarity threatens the myth. Here's the real reason this matters. If Africans carried astronomical knowledge across continents 5,000 years ago, then the story of human progress changes. Black people aren't late arrivals to civilization. They're early architects. And once you accept that, the entire hierarchy collapses. So ask yourself, why does Stonehenge get treated like a fluke, while African stone science gets ignored entirely? And what else would unravel if we stopped pretending these stones rose in isolation? Let's get surgical now. No hype, no fairy dust. Just the question everyone dodges because it messes with comfort. How did Stonehenge get built, and who actually had the knowledge to do it? Not who lived closest. Who had the math, the sky science, and the logistics to move mountains before machines? Stonehenge is not just rocks in a circle, that's the insult version. It's precision astronomy carved into geology. The stones line up with solstices. The angles repeat. The distances obey pattern. Somebody measured. Somebody planned. Somebody understood cycles longer than a human lifetime. And that kind of thinking doesn't pop up randomly in a foggy field. Here's the part they rush past in textbooks. Neolithic Britain had no written language, no recorded mathematics, no surviving star charts, no documented engineering tradition that explains how 80-ton stones were quarried, transported over hundreds of miles, and erected with millimeter-level intentionality. That's not shade. That's the historical record. So what usually happens next? They say ritual. They say mystery. They say we may never know. That's academic code for we don't want to follow this trail, because when you follow it, it doesn't stay in Britain. At the exact same time Stonehenge was being planned and modified, Africa and the Nile Valley were already deep into advanced astronomy, geometry, and monument construction. Not theory, evidence. Stone calendars older than Stonehenge, solar-aligned temples, surveying techniques using chords and angles, knowledge passed orally and ritually for generations. Now pause. This is not saying Africans sailed up and stacked the stones themselves. That's not the claim. The question is sharper than that. Did the knowledge that made Stonehenge possible originate elsewhere and travel? Because knowledge moves, always has. Neolithic Europe was not isolated. That's another myth. There were trade routes from the Mediterranean into Iberia, up through France, and into the British Isles. Obsidian moved, amber moved, ideas moved, people moved, and North Africa was plugged directly into that Mediterranean web. Here's a fact that makes historians uncomfortable. Megalithic architecture appears first in Africa and the Mediterranean, then later in Western Europe. Not the other way around. Stone circles, alignments, and solar temples don't originate in Britain. They arrive there late. Look at Nabta Playa in southern Egypt. Stone circle, astronomical alignment, thousands of years older than Stonehenge. Look at Meroe. Look at the Sahara before it dried, when it was green and populated by astronomer priests mapping the sky with stones. Same logic, same obsession with solstices, same marriage of ritual and math. So now ask yourself something uncomfortable. Is it more reasonable that isolated Neolithic farmers independently invented high-precision archaeoastronomy, or that they inherited pieces of a system already refined elsewhere? Because inheritance doesn't require domination. It requires contact. And contact we have. Genetic studies already shattered the fantasy of ancient Britain being homogeneous. Early Britons were not all pale. That's documented. Dark-skinned populations existed in Europe far earlier than most people realize. Again, not opinion, data. So when people hear African influence, they imagine boats pulling up and flags being planted. That's Hollywood thinking. Real history is quieter. It's techniques passed hand to hand. It's apprentices watching elders. It's sacred knowledge traveling disguised as ritual. And Stonehenge reeks of sacred knowledge. Those stones weren't random. The blue stones came from Wales, over 150 miles away. Why those stones? Why that distance? Why that alignment? Somebody knew something about resonance, symbolism, and celestial timing. That's not guesswork. That's system. Here's the trick academia pulls. They separate engineering from spirituality to make ancient people look naive. But in African knowledge systems, those were never separate. The sky mattered because it governed life. Time mattered because it governed survival. Building was worship. Measurement was prayer. Sound familiar? Because that same worldview shows up in Stonehenge. And here's the quiet part nobody likes to say out loud. Once you admit the knowledge may have come from Africa, you have to rethink who civilization listens to. You have to admit Europe wasn't always the source. Sometimes it was the student. That's why the question itself is treated like a joke. Not because it's weak, but because it's disruptive. So no, the question isn't, did Africans build Stonehenge? The real question is far more dangerous. Why does it terrify people to consider that African knowledge helped make Stonehenge possible? Stonehenge didn't rise in isolation. That's the lie that keeps getting repeated. A lonely monument on a cold island built by mysterious locals with no outside influence. Sounds poetic. Also sounds convenient, because once you place Stonehenge back into the real ancient world, a world of trade routes, migrations, shared knowledge, and long-distance contact, that story collapses fast. Let's get straight to it. By the time Stonehenge was being expanded into its iconic form, Africa was already a global knowledge hub, not future tense, already. The Nile Valley had mapped the stars. Nubia had mastered stone engineering. West Africa was developing complex ritual landscapes, and North Africa was plugged directly into Europe through the Mediterranean like a main artery. Britain wasn't isolated. It was late to the party. Here's the uncomfortable part. The astronomical precision at Stonehenge isn't beginner level. Alignments with solstices, lunar cycles, long-term tracking that requires generational data. That kind of planning doesn't come from trial and error. It comes from inherited science, from cultures that already did this repeatedly and passed it on. Now ask yourself something simple. Who on the planet was doing large-scale astronomical architecture first? It wasn't Northern Europe. In Africa, stone circles existed thousands of years earlier. Nabta Playa in southern Egypt predates Stonehenge by millennia, not centuries, millennia. And it wasn't random stones either. It tracked solstices. It aligned with stars. It was ritual and scientific at the same time. Same concept, earlier execution. But here's where it gets interesting. Archaeologists admit Britain had no indigenous stoneworking tradition capable of that scale before this period. Suddenly, megaliths appear. Suddenly, the math exists. Suddenly, the ritual language changes. That doesn't happen in a vacuum. That happens when ideas arrive. And ideas don't float. People carry them. We know ancient Africans traveled. That's not speculation. Egyptian ships reached the Levant regularly. Nubian traders moved north. North African seafarers dominated Mediterranean trade. Iberia and Britain were not unreachable. In fact, British tin was so valuable it was traded across the ancient world. You don't trade tin without contact, and you don't have contact without cultural exchange. Here's what never gets emphasized. Stonehenge sits inside a broader network of European megalithic sites that appear almost simultaneously. Same math, same ritual logic, same obsession with sky cycles. Different stones, same blueprint. Blueprints don't invent themselves in 10 places at once. Someone taught someone. And Africa had the oldest classroom. Now watch the language historians use. Influence, possible contact, independent development. That's academic code for discomfort, because once you say African knowledge influenced Europe, the hierarchy flips. Europe stops being the origin. It becomes the student, and that threatens the whole narrative. But let's talk symbols. The circle itself, sacred geometry, repetition, stones as ancestors, stones as timekeepers. That worldview is African to its core, not metaphorically, literally. You see it from the Sahara to the Nile to West Africa. Stones weren't decoration. They were memory. They were alignment between earth and sky. That philosophy shows up at Stonehenge fully formed, not experimental, fully formed. That's a receipt. Another one, burial practices, the use of sacred landscapes, processional paths, ritual movement tied to solar events. All of that mirrors African cosmology far more closely than anything native to prehistoric Britain. And when similarities pile up like that, coincidence stops being a reasonable answer. Here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. If African knowledge reached Britain, then Africans were present in some form, not necessarily as builders swinging hammers, that's the straw man people cling to, but as carriers of ideas, astronomy, ritual science. Teachers don't need to stay forever to leave fingerprints, and those fingerprints are everywhere. But notice how the question is always framed wrong. Did Africans build Stonehenge? That's the trap. It forces a yes or no that lets people dismiss the entire conversation. The real question is sharper. Who brought the knowledge that made Stonehenge possible? Because stones are easy, ideas are not. And once you follow the ideas backward, the trail keeps pointing south. What terrifies the gatekeepers isn't Africans touching Stonehenge. It's Africans touching the origin, story of Europe itself. Because if Europe's sacred monument traces back to African science, then the myth of European self-creation collapses. No wonder they prefer mystery, but mystery is just history with its teeth pulled, and the deeper you look, the clearer it gets. Stonehenge wasn't an accident, it wasn't isolated, and it definitely wasn't born in ignorance. It came from a world already shaped by African knowledge, a world Britain was stepping into late. So the real question isn't whether Africans were involved. The real question is how much of Europe's ancient foundation rests on knowledge they were never supposed to acknowledge. Let's get straight to it. The loudest argument against African involvement in Stonehenge isn't evidence, it's disbelief. Not scientific disbelief, cultural disbelief. The kind that says, that couldn't have happened, without ever asking, who benefited from saying it couldn't? Because here's the pattern you should notice by now. Anytime Africans show up early, advanced, organized, or influential outside Africa, the word impossible gets thrown around real fast. Impossible that Africans crossed oceans. Impossible that Africans navigated long distances. Impossible that Africans influenced Europe before Rome. Impossible that Africans had anything to do with a monument. Europeans still struggle to explain. Impossible. According to who? That's the question nobody wants to sit with. Because when archaeologists say there's no evidence Africans built Stonehenge, what they really mean is there's no evidence we're willing to interpret that way. Stonehenge itself is a confession of limits. They still debate how the stones were moved. They still debate why the site was chosen. They still debate who organized the labor. They still debate the knowledge behind the astronomy. So let's be honest. If they don't fully understand Stonehenge, how confident can they be about who didn't influence it? This is where the psychological wall goes up. European prehistory is treated like a sealed bubble. No outside input, no external knowledge, no cross-continental contact. But that idea collapses the moment you look at trade routes instead of borders. Africa was never isolated. The Mediterranean was not a barrier, it was a highway. North Africa was deeply connected to Iberia, Gaul, and the British Isles through trade, migration, and shared maritime knowledge. Tin, remember, was the key, and Britain was one of the ancient world's most important sources. You don't need Africans building Stonehenge stone by stone to matter. You only need Africans influencing the knowledge systems that made such construction meaningful. Calendars, solar alignments, ritual geometry, monumental planning. These aren't random village discoveries. They are hallmarks of civilizations that had already mastered timekeeping and cosmology. Africa had that mastery thousands of years earlier. So ask yourself something uncomfortable. Why is it easier for mainstream history to imagine isolated farmers accidentally creating one of the most precise astronomical monuments on Earth than to imagine knowledge moving from older civilizations into newer ones? Because one version protects a myth, the other threatens it. The myth says Europe woke up on its own. The truth says Europe learned, and learning implies a teacher. Now let's talk about classification games. When ancient remains in Britain show darker pigmentation, wider nasal structures, or non-local genetic markers, the language gets slippery. They don't say African, they say Mediterranean, they say Southern, they say non-local. Anything but the word that would make people ask harder questions. Because once you admit African presence in ancient Britain, the next question is unavoidable. What were they doing there? Trading, settling, teaching, advising elites? And if Africans were present, why couldn't African knowledge be present too? Stonehenge didn't exist in a vacuum. It was part of a larger prehistoric world obsessed with the sky, the sun, cycles, and power. Africa was leading that conversation long before Stonehenge was even imagined. So when historians say, there's no proof Africans built Stonehenge, remember what's really being said. There's no proof Africans built it alone. There's no proof Africans stacked every stone. There's no proof Africans left a plaque. But influence doesn't need signatures. Knowledge doesn't leave passports. Ideas don't announce their origin when they move, and here's the part that really gets avoided. If African knowledge helped shape Stonehenge, even indirectly, then Europe's most iconic prehistoric monument isn't purely European, and that breaks a story people are emotionally invested in. Because once you crack Stonehenge, you crack the Da'edasan illusion of isolated European genius. You start seeing Europe not as the starting point, but as a receiver. And that's why the resistance feels so intense. Not because the idea is weak, but because the implications are strong. So maybe the real question isn't, did Africans build Stonehenge? Maybe the real question is, why does the idea scare people so much? Let's kill the biggest myth holding this conversation hostage. Stonehenge did not rise in isolation. Not intellectually, not spiritually, not technologically. The idea that ancient Britain was some sealed-off cave while Africa and the Mediterranean were buzzing with advanced knowledge is fantasy. Comfortable fantasy. The kind that lets people believe genius just popped up randomly on cold islands while the rest of the ancient world was already trading, measuring stars, and moving stone like chess pieces. Here's the reality. Ancient Europe was plugged in. Long before Stonehenge reached its final form, trade, routes stitched together Africa, the Mediterranean, and Northern Europe. Amber from the Baltic shows up in Mycenaean graves. Tin from Britain ends up in Bronze Age tools across North Africa and the Levant. Gold, beads, shell jewelry, ritual objects, moving back and forth like a prehistoric internet. And where trade moves, ideas move faster. Astronomy didn't stay local. Sacred geometry didn't stay local. Ritual architecture didn't stay local. Now ask yourself this. If Britain had the raw materials, but Africa had the knowledge systems, what happens when they meet? Exactly. Stonehenge sits at the end of a long chain, not the beginning. It's not the birth of genius, it's the echo of it. Look at the design logic. Stonehenge isn't just rocks in a circle, it's calibrated. Solar alignments, lunar cycles, precision sight lines, the heel stone marking solstices with terrifying accuracy. This isn't trial and error, this is inherited math, passed down sky knowledge. And here's where the silence gets loud, because the same solar alignments show up thousands of miles away. In Nabta Playa in Nubia, southern Egypt, deep Africa, you find stone circles older than Stonehenge by at least 1,000 years, aligned to solstices, aligned to star risings, built by pastoral Africans tracking the sky long before Britain laid its first megalith. That's not coincidence, that's a lineage. But European history books treat Stonehenge like a miracle bubble. No parents, no teachers, no cousins, just mysterious ancient Britons waking up one day with cosmic knowledge. That story protects something, because if you admit that African civilizations already mastered astronomical stone architecture, then Stonehenge stops being uniquely European brilliance and starts looking like a regional remix of a much older African song, and that makes people uncomfortable. Now let's talk builders, not names, but capability. Moving stones weighing up to 50 tons requires planning, coordination, rope technology, leverage systems, and leadership. Africa had all of that on lock thousands of years earlier. Obelisks in Egypt weren't just bigger, they were transported farther, raised higher, and aligned more precisely. So when people say, but how would Africans influence Britain? They're asking the wrong question. The real question is, why do we assume they wouldn't? North Africans weren't trapped on the continent. They sailed. They traded. They navigated by stars Europeans hadn't even named yet. The Mediterranean was a highway, not a wall. And once knowledge enters southern Europe, it doesn't stop at the Alps. It keeps walking. Celtic cultures didn't exist in a vacuum. They absorbed. They adapted. They ritualized what they encountered. That's how cultures survive. And Stonehenge? Stonehenge feels like a ritual anchor, a ceremonial receiver, a place where imported cosmic knowledge got localized into stone. Notice something else. Stonehenge wasn't built all at once. It evolved over centuries. That matters because it suggests ongoing influence, ongoing refinement, new ideas being added, adjusted, realigned. That's what happens when a culture stays connected to broader currents instead of being cut off. But modern narratives hate continuity. They prefer mystery. Mystery keeps questions shallow. Mystery avoids responsibility. Because once you admit Stonehenge fits into a global ancient knowledge network, one where Africa was a primary source, you can't pretend European civilization sprang fully formed from the fog. You have to admit Europe learned, borrowed, adapted, and that flips the power story. Stonehenge stops being proof of isolated European genius and starts being evidence of ancient globalization, with Africa at the intellectual center. That's why documentaries love asking, how did they do it? But never ask, who taught them what to do? Because once you ask that question, the trail doesn't lead north, it leads south. And if Stonehenge was part of a shared ancient knowledge stream, then the biggest question isn't whether Africans were involved. It's why we were taught to never even consider it. So ask yourself, if the stones could talk, would they really tell the story we've been given? Let's land this plane clean. No myths, no wishful thinking, just pressure on the real question. Did Africans build Stonehenge in the simple, cartoon way people argue online? Probably not the way a Hollywood script would show it. No black army pulling stones across Salisbury Plain with dramatic music. That's not how real history moves. History moves through influence, trade, knowledge transfer, and systems. Quiet, slow, powerful. And that's exactly where this conversation gets dangerous. Because Stonehenge doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a much older global pattern, long before Britain had cities, writing, or monumental engineering traditions. Africa already did. Not once, repeatedly. Egypt, Nubia, Kush, the Sahara before it dried. These weren't just cultures. They were knowledge factories, astronomy, geometry, sacred landscapes aligned with solstices, megalithic stone traditions, ritual architecture tied to sky cycles. That wasn't Europe's original invention. Europe inherited fragments of it, and archaeology admits this part quietly. The builders of Stonehenge understood lunar cycles with terrifying accuracy. They tracked eclipses. They aligned stones with solstices to the degree that modern engineers still argue how it was done without advanced math. That knowledge didn't magically appear in Neolithic Britain like lightning from the sky. It had ancestors. Those ancestors lived south. Africa wasn't isolated. That's the lie everything rests on. The Mediterranean was a highway, not a wall. North Africa traded with Iberia. Iberia traded north. Ideas moved with people. Stones don't travel alone. Knowledge does. And here's the part that makes institutions nervous. When you compare Stonehenge's function, not its style, but its purpose, to African sacred sites, the similarities stack up, not identical, related. Cousins, not clones. Ritual centers, sky alignment. Ancestor memory encoded in stone, timekeeping tied to survival. That's not coincidence, that's diffusion. But diffusion ruins the fairy tale, because the fairy tale says Europe woke up alone, built alone, thought alone. And if that's true, then Europe owns modernity by birthright. But if Europe learned, if it absorbed, if it inherited, then the story shifts. And power hates shifts. So what do they do instead? They narrow the question. They trap you with wording. Did Africans build Stonehenge? They want you to say yes or no, so they can dismiss you either way. Say yes, they call you unserious. Say no, they say case closed. But that's not the real question. The real question is, why does Europe's most famous monument only make sense when viewed through older African knowledge systems? Why do the earliest advanced astronomical traditions come from Africa? Why do Europe's sacred landscapes appear after sustained contact with African and Mediterranean worlds? Why does European prehistory suddenly advance right after contact zones expand? That's the pattern nobody wants to sit with, because once you accept that, you have to accept something else. Africa wasn't behind, Africa was ahead, and Stonehenge becomes what it really is. Not an isolated miracle, but a downstream expression. A local adaptation of a global knowledge current that started long before Britain had a name. That doesn't diminish Stonehenge. It elevates it. It places it inside human continuity instead of European exceptionalism. But here's the psychological twist. They don't fear Africans building Stonehenge. They fear Africans belonging in the origin story of Europe. Because once you place Africa at the root, everything modern shifts. Science, philosophy, timekeeping, architecture, even identity. That's why this debate never dies. Not because the evidence is weak, but because the implications are strong. If Africa helped shape the thinking that shaped Stonehenge, then Africa helped shape Europe itself. And if that's true, what other European foundations are actually African shadows in disguise?